This is the fourth video in the SendGrid series. Now, in the last video, we walked through sending a simple single message using the REST API, and we used the PostMan HTTP client to do that. So now we're going to do the same thing using C#. So many of you have probably used the HTTP client class that is part of .NET. So one way we could approach this problem is simply to create an HTTP client, configure it with the appropriate post request, set the JSON body, get everything all set up, and then just send it asynchronously. And that absolutely works. And if you have written that kind of code, I would say it's a really good solution to this kind of problem. And if you haven't, but maybe you've used Axios or something like that in JavaScript, it ends up looking really similar, where you basically create an object, serialize it to JSON, and pass it in as the body of your HTTP request. So that totally would work. However, SendGrid actually has a NuGet package, which gives us some wrappers and convenience functions so that we can write C# without having to serialize the JSON, well, at least in part, as you'll see. So I got this to work. I like it. I've used it in production, and I wanted to show it to you. And then when you're done, you can decide which approach you would want to take. They both work. So here we go. We're going to start in Visual Studio and write some C# code. Here we are in Visual Studio, and we'll do File, New Project, and let's choose Console App. Next. And why don't we call this SendGrid Example? Next. And I do not want to use those top-level statements. Create. And now we have a little console app to work with. So we got to set up a few things. One thing that I'm going to do is in the project, I'm going to disable the nullables. It'll just keep some of the string properties a little cleaner, a little easier to see. Now we need to install some NuGet packages. So Tools, NuGet Package Manager, manage NuGet packages for the solution. And we can browse. So we need the Newtonsoft JSON package. So let's select that and install it. And let's search for system.configuration. And we're going to install the Microsoft Configuration Manager. And last, we're going to search for SendGrid. And we will install the SendGrid client library. And now if we clear our search and we go look at the installed packages, we should see those three. Bravo. And then in our program, I have some code already set up. Now, I'm going to do quite a bit of copy and paste, because if I were to attempt to type this all, we would be here for hours. It's going to be a long video as it is. So here's a little intro to our app. And let's just compile and run. And we should get a console window that comes up and welcomes us to our SendGrid tester. Perfect. Okay, now it's time to start writing some real code. So the first thing I want to do that is real is I want to add a new item, and we're going to choose an application configuration file. So this is our app config. And what we're going to do is we're going to put some app settings in here. And I've got them all ready, so I can just copy and paste them. And I've created two app settings. One is the SendGrid key, which is the same API key we've been using. And also, I've set something called SendGrid default from, which is the email address of that verified sender that we've been using. That way we can just pull this into our code using the configuration manager. Okay, those are app settings. And now let's actually start a class. And we're going to call this class SendGrid. And what I'm going to do is add a few namespaces that we're going to need here. So this one we don't need just yet, but we do need system configuration, SendGrid, and SendGrid.helpers.mail. And I'm going to mark this as a static class because it's just going to be a dispatcher for these methods. All right, as a little bit of support for our sending of messages, I'm going to put in a class called SendGrid Recipient Data. This is just my own construction to allow us to bundle an email, a name, and a dictionary of merge fields. You saw in the last video how we were able to merge some information like the recipient's score and their first name into the actual email. So this just gives us a standard way for the client to send that to us. And now we get to start writing our real code. So the first little helper function in SendGrid that I'll add is called getDefaultFrom, which will read our default from out of app settings. And the next little helper function that I'm going to put in is this one, which creates a SendGrid client. So the SendGrid client object is a wrapper for an HTTP client, and it is what we're going to use to actually send all of our requests. We're calling the basic constructor, which expects an API key, which we are reading out of configuration. And then the main method for today has got this signature. Oops, let's just take that out. Okay, C#. I don't need that. So what we've got here is a method called send single message with no template. And it takes a subject as an input. It takes the HTML body as an input. It takes a single recipient as the input. And in theory, somebody might want to override the default from if we had, multiple verified senders. So I've created this optional parameter. But then right away in the first line of the body code, I'm just going to make sure we have a valid from by checking it for whether it's blank and using the default if we didn't get one. So the next thing we got to do is create a SendGrid client for ourselves to use. Okay, now we're ready to actually get the message set up. And that's the first block of code. We're going to create something called a SendGrid message. So we're setting up this message object with subject, body, and from. So here's a new SendGrid message, setting the subject, setting the body, setting the from to a new email address, which has an email property. And we are instantiating this collection of personalizations. You may recall from the last video that in the JSON, we actually had a list of personalizations. Each one kind of can represent a recipient is one way to do it, that go with the message. So we need to initialize that class. It's not initialized by default with this constructor. And now we need to add our recipient. So this is a little complex. We're adding the recipient. So we're going to add a new personalization to the personalizations list that is in our message. And this personalization has two properties that we're setting. We're setting its to's property, and we're setting its substitutions property. So the to's property is a list of email addresses. It could be multiple people, but in this case, because we have a single recipient, we're just going to create the list of email addresses, and in its constructor, we're going to use our list initializer syntax to create a new email address on the fly, set its email and name. And then for the substitutions, it turns out that this property of the personalization, as defined by the SendGrid library, is a dictionary where the key is a string and the value is a string. So they want string-string key value pairs. And you can see that my little class models this as strings and objects. So the caller is going to pass in the score just as the number, 98, but we do have to convert it to a string. So we can use the to dictionary link function here, this extension method, to essentially convert our dictionary of string and object to a dictionary of string and string. So that's what this is doing. So K, it might be better to call it KVP. It's really a key value pair that we get in our predicate expression here. And the new dictionary is keyed by the key value pair dot key, and the value is the key value pair value to string. Okay, so there are actually two little predicate expressions. Okay, and now we are ready to send it. So when we send this, we're going to await sending the email message, and we're going to get back this response, which is, this response object, which is also defined by SendGrid. So I think actually we could type it that way. Yep, that's a little clearer. I really try to avoid var, especially in these cases where you need to understand what's happening. So the last thing I'm going to do here is just a little sanity check. We can, once we get that response back from the send email async method, we can check to see if it worked. So response has this is success status code Boolean. And if that worked, that'll be true. Otherwise, we can just throw an exception where we pass some information up. So I think that should work. Let me go ahead and just build that and see if we have any syntax errors. Nope, that works. So there we go. There is our send single message with no template. And now I think all we really need to do is test it out. So what I'm going to do there is we will go to our program, and let me copy the code over here. And I've got this set up kind of like this. I've actually got a little helper function called test async. And I can uncomment that and bring this over. So what this function is going to do is it is going to call our send single message no template function. It's going to pass in this subject, hello, and here we're using that star syntax. Again, you could use, there's nothing special about that. We just need to have strings that are going to do, where the string substitution is going to work. And then here's a little HTML body. Your score on the exam was score. And then we're going to create a new recipient to pass in, Sunita. And I'm using my personal email address there and the merge fields, Sunita's name and score. So I think this should now work. What I'm going to do here is we will just say test async. It's going to warn us that we're calling an async method and not handling the result. I'm okay with that. And I'm going to set a breakpoint here so we can step through this. So let's F5 to start our code running. And there's our breakpoint. So F10. And there we go. So now our code is running. We have our SendGrid client. We've got our message. We've added our personalization. And now let's go ahead and send it. And it looks like status code was true. So we can just do F5 and then we are out. So I got a notification on my other screen that I already received that mail message. So what I'm going to do is I will open up that mail message and let me bring it over here. And now you can see, hello, Sunita, your score on the exam was 98. Bravo. We sent a message via SendGrid using C#. Well done.